Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This is the Historical Societies of Santa Rosa's September webinar presentation. And this evening's presentation is going to be all about Santa Rosa's Rural Cemetery book, the new and revised expanded edition that has just come out this summer with fascinating stories of 5,500 lives. So as more people join us on our webinar this evening, I want to again thank you both on Zoom and on Facebook, where we're having a simultaneously live presentation on Facebook as well as here in our Zoom webinar. And once again, this evening's presentation is Santa Rosa's Rural Cemetery book, Fascinating Stories of 5,500 Lives. This evening's presenters are Sandra, who goes by Sandy Frary, and Ray Owen. A little bit about Sandy and Ray. Sandy is a retired civilian of Sonoma County's Sheriff's Office who worked closely with the County Coroner records in her research. And Ray Owen is a retired U.S. Army Intelligence Corp agent and investigator with the Civil Service Commission. They are both longtime volunteers of the Santa Rosa Cemetery and have put, I heard yesterday, 14 years of research into this book. So we are so proud on behalf of the Historical Society of Santa Rosa to welcome them both this evening. And Sandy will be going first with her presentation. Sandy, welcome.
Thank you, Leslie. I want you to know that this evening, Ray and I are going to, so to speak, share the stage. We're going to take turns of revealing the methods that we used to access material that produced the Rural Cemetery book. And I want to hold it up. If you can see the size of this book, mostly I want you to see how thick it is. It is a huge book. It is so full. It's really heavy, full of information that Ray and I researched for the past 13 years. That's the book. This evening, Ray and I are going to take turns sharing the stage to reveal the methods we use, as I said, to produce this book. And a little bit about the Rural Cemetery. It's Santa Rosa's oldest pioneer cemetery. It was established in 1854, a long time ago. It's located on almost 17 acres of rolling hills and majestic oaks. In fact, it's one of the largest wooded areas in Santa Rosa. And there are 5,514 known burials in Santa Rosa Rural Cemetery. Now, in 1979, the city of Santa Rosa declared the cemetery to be abandoned and took ownership. Since then, the cemetery has been run by all volunteers. We are all volunteers. I'm the archivist. I maintain all the burial records and the burial listings. And Ray, who's with me tonight, is our lead researcher. He is a powerhouse of research. He is just amazing. You're going to hear from him next, and he's going to explain many of his techniques he uses, which it's amazing. Like I said, he's just a powerhouse. So I'm going to start by telling you how I got involved in research the Rural Cemetery. As a hobby, I had done gravestone rubbings. I loved doing them. Just taking a paper to a stone and rubbing a colored wax and producing a picture. So in fact, in photo number photo 2, the gravestone rubbings, it shows one of the rubbings that I did. It's a small one, but okay, there's the cemetery. That is, okay, perfect. That's the Rural Cemetery. It's not the full map. We don't have room for the whole thing, but that's it. It's in various sections like main circle, western half circle, eastern half circle, and various sections like Moak Cemetery. That is the cemetery. This is where I started my gravestone rubbings, which I'm going to have yeah, there we go. That's just a sample of a little one that I did. Because I did rubbings, I was asked by several members of the Rural Cemetery Committee to record all the epitaphs on all the aging stones in the cemetery. No small task. It's 6 months. It took me 2 days a week, the spring of 2007 through the summer of 2007, but I got them all, hundreds and hundreds of rubbings. I got all the epitaphs. They're now in this booklet you're seeing on the screen now, it's a booklet that we sell at tours. All the epitaphs and little sayings and little stories. So that is for sale. That's of one of our tours. But during my 6 months there, I ran into all kinds of situations. Sometimes I could tell that there was an epitaph on a stone, but the stone had sunk. And I had to get that epitaph. So I would take a little shovel and actually dig up part of the stone, hoping no one would walk by and see me digging up what looked like a grave. But I was able to get all the epitaphs, and they're included in that book. Well, I was so diligent at showing up that one of the workmen happened to be the archivist at that time. And one day he stopped me and he said, "Sandy, I've been watching you. You're so diligent at getting all the information, getting the epitaphs, and I would like to know if you would take over the job of archivist." So I was relatively new to the committee, but I said yes. And since then, I've been the archivist. A funny story. One time before I became archivist, I was calling Alan Finney, who was the one in charge then and was the archivist, and kept on telling him, "It's wrong. The stone says this. What's in the book is wrong," because I was reading the stones by rubbing. People that came before me could only use their sight, and they couldn't make everything out. So one day I came to the cemetery to do my rounds of gravestone rubbings, and there was Alan, the archivist, on his hands and knees, looking over a gravestone. I said, "Alan, what are you doing?" He said, "This information you gave us, it's not there, it's wrong. What are you talking about?" I said, "Alan, look behind the stone." He did, and he goes, "Oh my gosh." I said, "Alan, when you do gravestone rubbings or when you research gravestones, look at the front, the back, the sides, the top, and the base, because I found them in every one of those places. So if any of you are interested in looking at gravestones, look at all sides, including even the base. You'll find the neatest things." Anyway, so I took over then as archivist, and I'm a little worried about research. I didn't know how to research. I was given the cemetery of over 5,000 people, and they wanted me to do research. So but I got an idea one day. I ran into a friend who had worked for the sheriff's office. He had been the chief deputy coroner, and he told me about all the interesting stories there in the coroner's office on all the coroner's death records. So I wrote a letter to Sheriff Conville at the time and asked him if I could come and go through all the old coroner's death records. He said, not only did he say yes, he said, "I'm going to have a computer for you, I have a desk for you." And so when I came, I was all set up. And they didn't put me in the back with the clerical. They put me right in with the investigators. So for the next 10 years that I was there at the coroner's office, I sat with the investigators. I knew everything that was going on. And it was really quite an education. But I also had access to all the coroner's death records, which, by the way, at that time were downstairs in the basement, which they called the Bat Cave. Very scary place. And it had an alarm. And every time I go down, I was so afraid I was going to trip the alarm. I never did, but it was always nerve-wracking. In the winter, it flooded. Finally, I convinced them to get all those records out of there and get them upstairs where it was dry. And eventually they did. But when I started going through the old coroner's death record books, I would start getting all stuffed up because of all the rag and mold, everything that came out. So eventually I decided to do it outside. So I went over to the autopsy room was there too. I went to the closet and I got the masks. I brought in a fan that ran by battery, and I sat out behind the morgue and I did all my research outside with a mask on and a fan going because the records were so bad. When I finished that, my next project was the coroner's inquest. Oh my gosh, I was so excited. I wanted the inquest about the lynching of the 3 men in Santa Rosa Cemetery for the murder of Sheriff Petrie and 2 San Francisco detectives. And I found it. I was just so excited. I put it in the microfilm machine and I read it. And it was readable. The microfilm was in good shape, but I could tell that the document itself had been kind of not great shape. Some of the letters were swollen. So I thought, I'm going to have to transcribe this. So I spent about 2 months transcribing it. And I just determined it was going to be exactly the way it appeared in the microfilm. The font was going to be the same. The spacing was going to be the same. The hardest thing was when there was a misspelled word, I had to type, and it's hard to type a misspelled word on purpose. I found it really hard, but The finished document is exactly a carbon copy practically of the original inquest. I then presented it to the history library downtown. They then put it on the internet. And since then it's had, hundreds of people read it. It's really very rewarding that so many people are that interesting. But that was one of the inquests that I wanted. And for those of you that might be interested in acquiring inquests with your research, they're readily accessible. They weren't at first. When I started at the coroner's office, the coroner refused to release them. And Ray and I actually started a crusade, and we met with the chief deputy coroner, and we produced evidence showing that inquests were public. And as a result, yes, now you can access them for free. And they're so helpful for doing your research. You can either call the sheriff's office and ask to speak to someone to order one, or you can go online, and the sheriff's office website has a form you can fill out and send in. They're absolutely free, and the information is just so invaluable. So I highly recommend it if you're going to do some research for someone in Sonoma County who died. Again, it has to be either died violently, suspiciously, or unexpectedly to be a coroner's case. So if you just died of a natural cause, you're probably not going to be in the coroner's office. You're not going to have an inquest. But anybody that died, as I said, unexpectedly, violently, or suspiciously, you're going to have an inquest, and you're going to have a report you can read. So I highly recommend you do that to augment your reports. They're really a treasure. Okay. Also, while I was at the coroner's office, I asked the chief deputy coroner if I could see the map and the records for the County of Sonoma Cemetery. There's a map, partial map of the cemetery. That is the map. I know it looks like it's just a diagram, but that's how it's laid out. A big rectangle with the rows. There's A through J rows, and then 1 through 35 for the graves. Right now, as we speak, there are 351 people buried there. And I think it's been one of the best kept secrets around. Few people even know the cemetery existed. When we were working on the book, I asked the chief deputy coroner if I could include it in the book, because it had never, ever, the burial listing had never, ever been shown publicly. And they said yes. So for the first time ever, you're going to be able to see the burial listings of everybody buried in the County of Sonoma Indigent Cemetery behind Santa Rosa Cemetery. It's in the back of our burial book. So that was very interesting. So I said, this isn't enough. According to the California State Safety Code, Health and Safety Code, you need a lot more information, like the place of death, funeral home, and so on. And you only have a list, and it didn't look this good. You could hardly read the names, only last names. And I kind of chewed them out. After that, I did that, I thought, oh, what did I just do? But so I opened my big mouth. So guess who was asked to identify all the bodies? Yeah. So I was actually kind of glad, because I said, okay, I can do it, but I need to have access to all the death certificates. Otherwise, how could I tell? I said, can you ask the chief deputy clerk if I can access the death certificates? And he said, oh, I don't think so, because you're a volunteer. I said, well, can you ask? He said, okay. She said, yes. Oh my gosh. I had access to all Sonoma County death certificates and death records. So I started basically working at the recorder's office. I was there about 3 years. I went through at least 5,000 death certificates individually. First of all, I did it for the County of Sonoma Cemetery. And by doing that, I was able to identify every single person. A few of them will never be able to identify, but they're mostly all identified there. So while I was doing that, I just started working on that. I received a call from a homicide detective at the sheriff's office asking for my help to identify and find a Jane Doe that had been buried there years ago. They didn't know where she was. And I thought, this isn't happening. This is TV. This doesn't happen to me, but it did happen to me. So I said, okay, I've just started, but give me a little more time to figure out which one is the right Jane Doe, because there are 5 Jane Does in that cemetery. So I called back and I said, okay, I think she's the one. By the way, this is a treasure. I convinced them to let me put this in the book. This is a photo of what Jane Doe probably looked like. This is a reconstruction. This is the one that they asked me to find. When they found her, She was outside a winery in Healdsburg, and they brought her back. She was missing her head, but they brought back her remains, and they were never able to identify her. They had found that a serial killer had been arrested, and records in his computer showed he had been in Healdsburg around that time. So they wanted to check and see if anybody had been found dead near Healdsburg at that time. Voila, Jane Doe. She was perfect. So they wanted to exhume her. That's why they wanted my help. So I told them, I think she's the one in the drainage ditch. And they said, well, you got to be sure, because we're calling in a forensic team from San Francisco, and we don't want to exhume the wrong girl. I said, oh, no pressure here. Okay, so I did a little more research, called back and said it's her. She's got to be in the drainage, the one near the drainage ditch. And then I said, how soon after you exhume her will you know if I had ID'd the right girl? And I was told right there at the grave, because we have excellent dental records and skull x-rays. And I don't know where this came from, but all of a sudden I heard myself saying, well, I want to be there. I've got to know that I've got the right girl. I don't want to be sitting home worrying with my fingers crossed that I've done the wrong girl. So they said yes. Oh my gosh. So there I was in the April day, sunny April day. I came a little bit late because I knew they were going to be setting up. And the forensic team was there, detectives, all kinds of people. The yellow tape they put around to keep people away was all around there. And I came a little bit late. And I walked down, I lifted up, and I walked under the tape. And someone came running over to me and said, ma'am, you can't go through here. This is off limits. And I explained that it was okay that I was there. They're digging because I told them to dig there. So I was allowed to stay and watch a body be exhumed, which was something I would never have imagined I would ever do, but I did. It was totally interesting. She had been buried next to a drainage ditch. They bailed as much water out of that grave as they did dirt. When they finally raised the coffin, I stared at that coffin and I said, there's something terribly wrong, because it wasn't just a flat coffin. It was a wooden coffin. It was flat, most of it, but the top part was a big round bubble. And I thought, wow, that is quite a bit of bowing. Well, it turned out it was not bowing. It turned out that when Jane Doe was discovered, her skull was missing. They found it later. And when they got ready to bury her, they took her skull, dropped it in the bucket, and they put her and the bucket in the coffin and closed it and put her in the ground. Well, she was in the ground about 27 years. Over time, the weight of the dirt and the water, because she was right near a drainage ditch, compressed the coffin so much. That's what it did. It was incredible. So then they're getting ready to open it. Do you think they could open that coffin? No. It had been in the ground 27 years, wet. It wouldn't open. They had to get a crowbar to open the coffin. So finally they get the coffin open. And I'm standing, I think, fingers crossed, thinking, please, please, please be that right girl. They bent down. I could see I kind of stood back. And I could see they were checking things. And pretty soon one of the detectives turned to me and said, Sandy, you got the right girl. I was so relieved. It was just so exciting. Then they then called the coroner's van to come. I went down, let him in, rode back with it. We put her in the back. I rode down to the gate with Jane Doe in the back, and off they went to the morgue. Unfortunately, we were not able to identify her. There was no DNA to match. And when she was found years ago, 27 years before, there was no DNA. We had hoped that maybe we could find her somehow. We never did find her, and she has once again been reinterred back in the county cemetery. But that was just my first experience with Jane Doe. And my second experience was with a John Doe. In 2015, a young man was found. I think it was Rohnert Park. Anyway, he was dead, and no at all information on him at all. He had glasses. He had a beard. He looked like he was kind of heavy to me. Looked like he would have been a very jolly person, but no information, no DNA. We tried various banks that track DNA, nothing. Finally, we shipped him off to Willits, where they reduced his body down to a skeletal remains, where they could then do an anthropology report by judging his bones. And then he was returned to us. The chief deputy coroner at that time was, we got along really well. He would take me a lot of places with him. I learned a lot about forensics from him. When we got John Doe back, he took me with him to the mortuary and we picked out the coffin and all the information, and I got to choose his grave. So John Doe is buried in row F, grave 1, because that's the one I picked for him. When the day came to bury him, I thought I would come a little bit later. I get a call that morning from the mortuary. Sandy, the chief deputy coroner can't come. Nobody knows how to get to the cemetery or how to get in or what to do. Can you come and direct everyone? I thought, oh, okay. So I went back to the mortuary rather, and got in line. I went first. The hearse came next with the coffin of John Doe in it, and John Doe in the coffin. And behind that was a coroner's of a car. I put my lights on and I led a funeral procession through Santa Rosa. Again, I couldn't believe this was happening to me. This happens in the movies, but there I was. I led him right up to the cemetery, got out, unlocked the gate, and led him to the grave. We got there. They took John Doe's coffin, laid it in the grave, and I said, wait a minute. I mean, I felt like I knew this man. I picked out his coffin, I picked out his grave, I knew his whole story. I said, I want to say a few words. So I did. I stood there and said a few nice words to poor John Doe, and then he was buried. And that was the end of that. Those are a couple of my escapades, my experiences, my adventures that I had at the coroner's office, not to mention all the information. In fact, I think you probably all know Jeremy Nichols. I found a couple of people Jeremy didn't know existed by going through the coroner's records. So that not only helped the Rural Cemetery, but also helped Jeremy and the Sinead Cemetery as well. So that was my experience at the coroner's office. Okay. Also, I have a story I want to share with you about researching. This is not someone that's buried in the Rural Cemetery, but because I'm the archivist, I get all the calls from the city. Anybody has a question about anybody, they get sent to me. And I also want to mention that even if someone is not buried in the Rural Cemetery, Ray and I will help that person. We will research anybody. We will help anybody that we can because we have access to so many records. So I get a call one day from the city saying they were sending an email from a man in Finland. I thought, oh, wow, okay, Finland. So I read his email and I couldn't believe what I was reading. This man was looking for his great uncle. He had died in, when was it? 1927, and nobody could find him. But what really got me was when he said he was a Titanic survivor. I thought, what is this story? I mean, a Titanic, that was far away, and this is California, and most of the survivors were women and children. I mean, they got on lifeboats first. What is this story? So when I got through reading, I went online and I checked the Titanic survivor website. And there was his uncle's name, and it's showing he wasn't found. His name was John Niskanen, Niskanen. You see a picture of him right there. And they had never found him. So we started having a conversation back and forth with his great nephew in Finland. As it turned out, he was planning to come to Santa Rosa on his way through to a car show somewhere in this area. And he wanted to stop by and see if I could show him where the grave was. And I thought, well, we know he's not in Santa Rosa Rural Cemetery, but because we will research anybody, we will help anybody. I took up the case. First thing I did was call my lead researcher, Ray Owen. I said, Ray, see what you can find on this guy. So he talked to the people down at the library, and they actually had someone come in earlier, probably a couple of years earlier, looking for him. People have been looking for this man for ages. Nobody can find where he ended up. So Ray said, they said they've got the inquest. I said, well, okay, let me come down and take a look at the inquest. So I did. And I looked through it, And because I have seen so many inquests, I know exactly what's in an inquest. I know what you're going to find and what's going to be said. I'm going, wait a minute, something's missing. I said, is this all you got? They said, yes, that's what they said. I said, something's missing. No one has asked the right question. I'm going to ask the right question. Where is his death certificate? They said, oh, well, we didn't get it. I said, death certificates always are with inquests. I've never seen an inquest yet without a death certificate attached. So for some reason, maybe back then when he was looking, they didn't allow, I don't know, maybe because of privacy, I don't know what it was, but they did not include the death certificate. So because I had worked at the recorder's office for 3 years, I knew exactly what to do. So I personally went over to the recorder's office and went back to the back to where the death certificates are on file. Now, back then, all my researching of death certificates were on a microfilm reel. They weren't digitized yet. So I had to put these big reels in back and forth. And we went through all of them year after year. It was always winding the microfilm to get the information. So I asked for her to get the microfilm reel that had the date, I just said 1927. So she went back and pulled out, and she stuck it in her reader. And she pulled it up to go, here it is. I said, okay, now tell me, what does it say for place of burial? And she goes, oh, it's all squiggles, you can't read it. I said, okay, turn the screen around, let me take a look at it. She turned it around, and I looked, and I thought, oh my gosh, now we know where he's buried. His place of death, or his place of burial, was very, very clear. No one had, if they had looked at it, they didn't read it properly. It did say IOOF, which is what records had shown, but IOOF had no record of him there. So obviously he was not buried there. But below IOOF, which was kind of squiggling, they didn't know what it was, it said Guerneville. Oh my gosh, that's where he is. He's been there since 1927, buried in Guerneville, and nobody knew, because back then it was called Oddfellow Cemetery back in 1927. It had since been sold and now is owned by, I believe, Pleasant Hills. That's their cemetery now, the private cemetery. But that's where he was. And unfortunately, years back, I'm told, someone had taken a book with all the burials listed in that cemetery and gone to the cemetery to do some research and left the book on the seat in the truck. When he came back, oh my gosh, someone had stolen it. To this day, they have never found it. So they don't know now who's buried. Well, if you have a gravestone, you know, but they don't know where everybody else is. So if they still have the book, they probably could point to the exact grave where John Niskanen is buried, but they didn't. So they did point out that one section of the cemetery is for indigents, and that's most likely where he is. Well, so Ray and I decided to go out to the cemetery, the Guerneville Cemetery. So I talked to John Niskanen's great nephew, and he came to Santa Rosa. We met him at the Oddfellows in Santa Rosa. We called Chris Smith, the press Democrat, and Chris Smith drove us all out to Guerneville Cemetery. And we met the archivist and the Casadero archivist, all of them met there. By the way, I probably should mention that despite the fact that John Niskanen survived, from what I understand, he was turned away from 2 lifeboats while the Titanic was sinking because, you know, women and children. Finally, there was a 3rd lifeboat. It wasn't full, so they allowed him to get on. That's the only reason why he made it. So he made it back to the United States. He left his family back in Finland, and he refused to ever have them come out for fear they would go through the same fate he went through of almost drowning on a sinking ship. So he never saw his family again. He lived a very solitary life. He never told anyone that he was a member, that he had survived the Titanic. No one even knew. So when he died, they could have cared less. He had lots of problems. I think he had some mental problems. So finally one day, I guess his date of death was August 13th of 1927. He lit his cabin in Casadero, which is where he was, on fire, took a gun to his head, shot himself, and that was the end of John. Well, when he was finally taken away, taken to Guerneville Cemetery, nobody knew anything about him. He was just another indigent. And so for all these years, he's lied buried there in that cemetery as an indigent. Now, the world knows, because I'm sure it's on their website now, where John Niskanen is buried. He's buried in the cemetery, formerly IOOF, Oddfellows, now Pleasant Hill Cemetery in Gurnville. That was such a thrill. And the other day, I ended up working for the coroner's office for 10 years too, volunteering there. And one of the things I did was do all the reporting to the Consumer Protection Agency for deaths related to consumer products. You know, when you hear on the news that so-and-so has been recalled because some people were killed, that's because someone like me in every coroner's office in the United States has sent in these reports. This is what I did every month. Well, of course, the pandemic struck. So they haven't been done for a while because I haven't been there. So a gentleman from the agency came in not too long ago and asked to see the records and talk to someone who did it. So I was contacted. And I'm now going to be given all the records and be doing this at home now for them. But in the meantime, the gentleman that wanted to meet with me from the agency called me and he said, oh, I see you've been very busy and you're into research. I said, how'd you know? He goes, on the internet. You found the Titanic survivor. So, oh my gosh, I didn't realize it's on there. Yes, I did. So that's a feather in my cap. And with that, I'd like to end on a high note. That is my my grand finale. So if you have any questions about anything I've said or research, please leave your questions. And I'm going to now kind of quietly move aside. And I want to introduce my lead researcher, Ray Owen.
Yeah.
You ready? Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to discuss some of the sources that we used to compile the data. Now, the entries have a standard format in the book. It shows the name, the plot number if known, date of birth, place of birth, parents, and their dates and places of birth, source info, including the informant, and then remarks. So of the sources used, we use death certificates, many of which have been previously searched, and Sandy had kind of unique access to them. We used the California Death Index, census records, marriage records, coroner's inquests, obituaries, miscellaneous records like ancestry for biographical data, find a grave, and so forth. So the use of the California Death Index, it records the date and if it's out of county, so we know what county the death occurred, and we can search further for obituaries. Also shows the age of the deceased. We use census records, which help produce the parents' names and places of birth. There's an addendum to the census records 1850 through 1880. It's called a mortality schedule. And the mortality schedule lists those who died the prior year. And from that, you can determine the cause of death, which is cause of death. We've shown it as much as we could determine it. It's of particular importance to people who are researching their family medical history. We use marriage records, and the marriage records in Sonoma County are indexed from 1850 to 1898. And of course, they're useful in determining if it's a woman, her maiden name, if she was married. Also, marriage records, I'm going to mention, if the marriage was not performed by an ordained minister, priest, rabbi, or a designated official, they are not found in the marriage records. They're found at the recorder's office in the book of bonds and agreements. Hardly anyone knows that. There's not a lot of them, but I've seen, I don't know, 20 some. As Sandy mentioned, we made extensive use of coroner's inquests. Now, an inquest was open to the public. Therefore, the record of the inquest is public, and that's been run by the county council. Today, they don't have inquests, they have coroner's investigations. You can also obtain those. However, they are vetted before the record is released, in case the investigators have, open leads that they don't want to disclose. We made extensive use of obituaries from the county newspapers. If it's out of county, some of them are on newspapers.com, or you can obtain them through the interlibrary loan system. Also, the vital data that appears in the county newspapers has been abstracted and indexed from 1855 to 1927. And those volumes are at the history annex behind the main library. We use various miscellaneous records. Ancestry is very helpful. It often reveals the mother's maiden name. We also used county atlases that have many biographies, and the atlases are again at the history annex. To some extent, we used voter registration records, particularly for men. Sometimes you run across variations in the name, different spellings. Well, voter registration started in 1867. And of course, it was only men until like 1912. But those records showing the names are quite reliable because there was a legal reason to have that name right. They had to swear to it. So you might keep that in mind. There are a lot of biographies and local histories. And those local histories are at the annex. Some of them are in books where people paid to have their information put in. And amazingly, they're always highly favorable. There is also, not known to everyone, at the library, at the history annex, is the Sonoma County, let's see, what do they call it? They call it a history annex. Thousands of names have been abstracted from newspapers and other documents and put in the history index. So you want to be sure to check that if you're researching. In the first editions, we obtained the mortuary records from Lafferty and Smith. They're included. We looked at probate files. They often show parents' names, heirs, and so forth. Draft registrations of World War I and World War II are very useful because the information comes from the subject, and it shows the name, the date, and place of birth. And assuredly, they knew when and where they were born. The death records of Sonoma County are indexed from 1850 until 1905. There were line entries in journals. Well, those journals were gone through previously, and anyone that showed burial in rural cemetery was included in our database. But there were a number of them that said Santa Rosa Cemetery. Those were not included. Well, it finally dawned on me that Oddfellows Cemetery was established in 1885. Calvary was established in 1887. Therefore, those entries, Santa Rosa Cemetery, before 1885, is synonymous with rural.
Mhm.
And we confirmed that because many of them have stones. So that was, kind of eye-opening. Another kind of unusual record was Superior Court minutes. If a member of the bar died, and I'm talking 1890s, 1900, 19 teens, I'm not sure how far it goes. If it was a member of the bar, a committee was formed from the bar and a biography constructed. And those biographies were entered into the Superior Court minutes as a testimonial or a resolution. And the ones I've seen run from 1 to 3 pages. So if you're looking at a former bar member, don't overlook that. Military records, particularly with Civil War soldiers. On Ancestry, you can obtain the service record, which customarily shows not only the unit, but the dates of service. You can go from that to a volume called The Compendium of the War of the Rebellion by Frederick Dreyer. Look up the regiment, and it outlines the regimental history. So you can gain an understanding of what that veteran went through by the campaigns and so forth. It also shows the mortality rate, both those killed in battle and those from illness. Illness far exceeds battlefield deaths. And I've seen regiments that had a mortality rate of 45%. So roughly of every 10 soldiers that went off to war, only 5 of them came back. I'm going to relate a couple items here to show you how records are used. We used them. The first one, a question came up, what's the origin of the name of Slater Street in Santa Rosa? Slater Street runs north from College, about 2 blocks east of Mendocino. Now, if you ask anyone, the response is most likely going to be Herbert Slater. Herbert Slater was a very well-known Santa Rosan. He was active in fraternal organizations. He represented the county at the state legislature. He wrote a weekly outdoor column for the newspaper, and he also wrote other articles. Well, Slater Street is not named for him. It's named for Mary Ellen Slater. She's buried in rural cemetery. She has a headstone. And when we got the original data, we looked at the obituary, and in the obituary, it stated that Slater Street was named for her. So I've written a narrative on it. I just want to go through a few things and demonstrate where we got the information. She was born the 27th of August, 1826 in Maine. That she was also born at Hollowell, Maine, a town on the outskirts of Augusta. That comes from Maine birth records. Of all things, they're online, clear back at least till 1826. She was enumerated in the 1850 census at Augusta, Maine, in the household of Nicholas and Rhoda Slater. She was the oldest of 6 siblings. On her birth certificate, it lists her father, Nicholas, and her mother, Rhoda. From an 1843 probate record of her mother, it was established that her maiden name was Page. Interestingly, her maternal grandfather, Caleb Page, was a veteran of the Revolution. In 1865, in the Massachusetts state census, she and family were enumerated in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, and her occupation was a dressmaker. According to her obituary in the Santa Rosa Republican, another source, she came to Santa Rosa in 1875 and purchased a ranch north of town, which she later sold to Thomas Lake Harris. And that property became the Fountain Grove Vineyards. In the census of 1880, both Mary Ellen and her mother Rhoda were enumerated on College Avenue. And according to the obituary, after her sale to Thomas Lake Harris, she purchased property on College Avenue, and the constructed street Slater was named for her. In the Santa Rosa City Directory of 1903-1904, her address was listed as 605 College Avenue, and that's because the house faced College, not Slater. Incidentally, when you look at city directories, the information you're looking at was collected the year before. So if the 1903 city directory shows her address, that address was accurate as of 1902. She died in San Francisco on the 9th of March following an operation. And finally, in terms of character and conduct, her obituary in the Santa Rosa Republican stipulated, quote, she was a cheerful, happy, and industrious woman who delighted in doing good deeds. She was popular with those who knew her. So by taking these various sources, you can construct a pretty detailed biography on the individual. And the other example I want to use is Terrence Fitz. In our database, there's an entry of just initials, TJF, and it has a plot number. Moak 234. Included in the entry is born 1880, died 1920. Well, I was curious, who was that? So I took the newspaper abstracts of 1920, which were at the library, and I went through looking for identical initials. I did not find them. The closest I found was Terrence Fitz, F-I-T-T-S. Oh, it's on the screen. The year of death corresponded to what was on the stone. So I looked more closely at him, and he served in the Spanish-American War, and his service jacket showed his middle name as Joseph. Then I went to the World War I draft registration, and sure enough, his name was Terrence Joseph Fitz. Now, let me explain about Fitz. He was the son of a prominent Santa Rosa family, and he turned out to be a criminal. And he was affiliated with the notorious Howard Street gang of San Francisco. Well, in 1920, detectives were looking for him and his associates, George Boyd and Joseph Valento.
Charles.
Not Joseph.
Charles Valento.
What?
Charles Valento.
Yeah, Charles Valento, I'm sorry. They were located in San Francisco, hiding out in a building. And on the 5th of December, 2 San Francisco detectives and James Petrie, sheriff of Sonoma County, attempted to arrest him. There was a shootout. The detectives and the sheriff were killed. The 3 were apprehended and put in jail. On the night of the 9th of December, a mob from Healdsburg broke into the jail, took the 3 suspects up to Rural Cemetery, and lynched them. Now, there was a cover-up on where the burials of Boyd and Fitz occurred. Welty brothers handled the matter, and Sandy and I have copies of the Welty mortuary records. On the 10th of December, there was a public viewing, and like 3,000 people tromped through the funeral home to look at these guys. On the 11th, Frank Welty announced that they had been buried in an undisclosed location, and he wouldn't disclose it because of the wishes of the Fitz family. Boyd had no relatives here. And there was a concern that if the graves were found, they would be vandalized and the bodies desecrated. Then a few days later, Welty changed his story and said, no, the bodies are still at the mortuary. They haven't been buried yet. Well, people looked to try to find the graves, couldn't find anything. Oddfellows reported that they had not agreed to bury Fitz in the family plot because it wasn't in their contract. And the grave sites have remained unknown until today. Well, the stone for Terrence Fitz is an unusual stone. It's an oblong concrete stone. His father, who's buried in Oddfellows, has the same type footstone with the initials, Jonathan P. Fitz. The stone in Moak faces away from the road, so the casual observer would not be able to see the stone. I think and also Boyd's death record at the funeral home shows buried in Moak. Fitz's just says rural. It's been penciled in later. I think there's no doubt but that TJF is Terrence Joseph Fitz.
Correct.
And in that plot, it's on the north side, there's a triangle, and there is room for another full casket burial. And I suspect that that's Boyd, but I can't prove it. So I wrote an article that's on, what is it on?
Facebook.
Facebook?
Royal Cemetery Facebook page.
Facebook, yeah. I titled it Century-Old Mystery Solved. So if you want to read it, it goes into a lot more detail. But nobody has disagreed with me, and I can't find any credible contradictory information. So that's kind of an example of an investigation that and what sources we used. And I think it has a successful conclusion. So that's my presentation. I'm plenty willing to take questions later.
Great. Thank you, both Ray and Sandy, for those presentations. We're already getting quite a few compliments about all of your work and sharing all of this great information with us. I think it opens our eyes to look at research and information, historical records, the coroner's office, the recorder's office, all of these great resources a little bit differently, especially as the great way that you both are telling these stories of not only the information, but these wonderful adventures. Sandy, these, well, I don't know how wonderful they are. The way that you tell them, it sounds very wonderful, but some of us would be a little aghast of all of a sudden being at a person's exhumation, right? So that would be a little tough to handle, but you seem to just go through it so gracefully. So thank you so much for sharing all of those wonderful stories. And Ray, we can really tell how your past life as an investigator has paid off for our community, right? When all of your research, you really go into all of the fine details and you don't let any of those loose strings stay loose.
It's helpful if you have an investigator's attitude, because as an investigator, no is just a starting point.
You don't take no for an answer, it sounds like. That's just means that you're gonna have to go down a different path.
That's right.
Well, that's really amazing. And I love also the interplay between the newer technology. You're talking about ancestry.com, but then you're also talking about these death certificates and going back to 1927, or having to look up the microfiche. and the film records. So there's really an interplay of all of these different technologies over time. Was that something that either one of you had to kind of get used to during your research, is advances in technology?
To some extent, yes. But I had a lot of help from the staff at the local history annex. They know how to do all that stuff. And I'm not really very computer able. So if I couldn't figure out, they'd show the dummy how it's done.
Well, it looks like you've been successful in figuring that out. And again, you know how to resource the resources to get the information.
Pretty much so. I'm always learning something new.
Well, that sounds like it's a great place for us to be inspired to learn something new from both of you. So at this point, just like the question that I just asked, if you have those types of questions for both Sandy and Ray, you can type them into the chat room in Zoom, or if you're joining us live on Facebook, you can also key in the questions onto the Facebook comments, and those will be related to us here on Zoom. So we'll be taking your questions and facilitating them over to Sandy and Ray so that they can give us some of those answers. I did see earlier on Facebook that Ellen Bowen said that you guys are a treasure to our community, all of your work and your efforts. You mentioned yesterday when we were talking that it was about 14 years of research and painstaking research, it sounds like, but it sounds like it's even more than that, because you're taking your information from all of the different research that you've done even before that time. Is that true, Sandy?
Yes, I also want to mention the burial listing database of the 5,514 people. It lists all of the statistics like name, dates of birth, and so on, parents. Also, stories and information. There's also a field for sources. We cite all our sources. So you're not going to say, well, where'd that come from? You can read. Every burial listing has sources where we got the information from. So we do document everything.
So then, in fact, your book, the Santa Rosa Rural Cemetery book, becomes a resource in and of itself.
Absolutely. Just look at and see where all those sources were, and you can just follow the same thing yourself, right?
That's great. And that's great for everybody here in Santa Rosa, those folks that may have family members in the rural cemetery, or just maybe are inspired to go and look up, past not only relatives, but friends and family, co-workers, friends and family. And you said that you get people making inquiries or actually buying your book from all over the United States and possibly the world, correct?
Correct.
That's great. And how do people actually get a copy of your book?
It's sold at the Finley Community Center, and and also at the Guerneville, West Steele Lane Center there. Those two places. You can go in and buy it, or you can call and they will mail it to you.
Great. So the city of Santa Rosa, who had set up this volunteer organization to help take care of the rural cemetery, is in fact being the conduit for us to go and get one of those books, either at the Finley Center or at Steele Lane, both of those community centers, or give them a call and they'll be able to send you one of the books. A little bit extra for shipping, potentially.
Correct. It's $20 for shipping no matter where. So if you can get there yourself, I recommend going and getting it. But they're being sent all over the United States, so it's $20. So yeah.
Yeah, and how much is the book?
It sells for $45.
Okay.
And they are going fast. I'm so pleased that it's being received so well. Yeah.
Well, that's really wonderful. It's just a testament to the hard work and energy that you've put into the Santa Rosa Rural Cemetery book. And so you guys did the first book.
We didn't.
You didn't do the first book.
The people that went before us did. Actually, this is the third book. And
Oh,
the first two books, they just didn't have access to the resources that Ray and I have had, or they didn't put 13, 14 years in like we did. So they were not nearly as thorough, but this is really thorough. Yeah. So we're the third book.
I might add that we added 500 roughly
Oh, yeah.
entries. We also deleted over 300.
Yes. Erroneous.
They were erroneous.
We will find people buried who have been buried in out on the coast, showed up in the rural cemetery burial list. So we had a lot of weeding out. I don't know how these people got in there, but I think it's pretty clean now. These people.
okay. So
Yeah.
previous editions had entries that weren't actually at the rural cemetery.
Right. They did
Oh.
errors, lots of errors. We made thousands of corrections. We added thousands of information, and we added over 500 new burials that had never been recorded. And we deleted about 367, which were either duplicates or they weren't buried there. I don't know how the names got in there, but it's pretty clean now.
Wow, that's great. It really stood out to me when you were discussing your etchings and how you really have to look at the stone on all sides.
Correct.
So how did you know that?
Just by accident. I mean, I was touching those stones. I've touched every single stone in that cemetery. And after a while, you start realizing, oh, and then you think, I better check. And they find someone else, you go, I better check there too. So I just learned. There was one stone for little Mabel Gould. She was about 7 when she died. Just a little stone in the corner of her plot. And it was sad. And I just happened to glance at the back, and the very bottom corner in small letters said, "Our pet," which was a term of endearment back then. I just could tell the parents were just, heartbroken. But it was back in the corner of that little stone. I doubt anybody even knew until I found it that day. Yeah. A lot of surprises. A lot of surprises. Yeah.
Yeah. And Ray, that brings up the stones that you talked about right at the end, right there, of Terrence Fitz and Terrence Joseph Fitz and his dad. So I'm sure that you have walked the cemetery many, 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 many times, countless times. How were those stones that you had seen before and didn't know what the reference was?
No.
And okay, tell
Like
us that
I said,
story.
Terrence Fitz stone faces away, and unless you go into the plot, you'll never see the initials.
Mhm.
Now, somebody did go in the plot when we compiled the database, which was customary. We went in every plot and recorded what we could see. But no, I think that might have to do with the desire to keep the grave unknown. It's like just initials only. Well, a couple of dates. The plot is capped now. Another precaution against vandalism. But that's my opinion.
You said the plot is capped. What does that mean?
There's a cement slab poured over it.
Oh, okay.
So you can't dig through the dirt. You got a slab in your way. And that was done for various reasons. One was upkeep. With a slab, you didn't have to pull weeds,
These little things that, to someone like me that doesn't have the experience and the information that you guys have availed yourselves to and researched, I could walk that cemetery and not know that information. So again, that story it's pretty new, I would assume. Is that in your book about the Terrence Fitz plot?
There's an account. We have him listed, but plot unknown. But there is an account of the shootout and the lynching and all that. Yeah, that is in the book. But now we can attach a plot to it and annotated that the stone merely bears initials and dates.
So this really was breaking information here, folks, right here tonight. This was first ever heard.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's great. Well, thank you for making this your premiere for that information. I really appreciate it. It's some exciting stuff. We didn't even know to highlight that. So now everybody's I know where people are going to be walking this weekend to go and see if they can find that, right? So, and what is your next project? Are you guys, I would assume you're kind of taking a break, except maybe fielding those emails and people's questions. You said you really try to help people out no matter what cemetery they're inquiring about, but do you have a next project that you have in mind?
This project will never end. I'm already working on the next. I'm getting so many updates and calls from descendants and corrections and books and stuff. So I'm already adding more information. So this will go on and on until I'm gone and someone else will take it over. So yeah, that's the next project, the next edition.
The next edition is already being written as we speak, as they would say.
Yes,
and speaking of that, not only if you have a question, but if you might have a story to tell, you can key it into the chat here on our Zoom live, or you can key that in on Facebook in the comments, and we'll share that with Sandy and Ray. How do people get a hold of you? Do you have like an organization email address, or is it just your personal email address?
The City of Santa Rosa Park and Recreation and Parks Department.
Okay, so people relate information to them,
Yes.
and then Santa Rosa City Rec and Parks relates the information to you.
Correct.
Okay, so that was just like the gentleman who is from Finland, who his was it great grandfather? Uncle was survived from the Titanic.
We contacted the City of Santa Rosa Rec Department, and then they put them through to me. Yeah.
Right, and I remember that article, the Chris Smith article, coming out in the Press Democrat.
Quite exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, that was very exciting. You guys are a couple superstars here. A couple superstar sleuths, I should say.
Okay.
Well, it's just amazing information. You know, the more that we can have history kind of come alive, especially Ray, with some of the stories that you shared and those details that just keep going back and back. I did see a comment also on Facebook that people really loved the sharing of the story about Slater Street, and how that's not Herbert Slater, that's actually, and I did write that down, Mary Ellen Slater. And I find that particularly interesting because we don't have as many streets named after women that we do as men, right? So it's wonderful to hear that a street here locally was named after a woman. I know that there's a few more, but that's a great discovery, I think.
The story on Mary Ellen Slater is going to be published in the Cemetery at some point. I've already submitted it to the editor. So it reads better than I speak, believe me.
Well, I think you did it justice, that's for sure. That was great information. It was great to be able to trace her family all the way back to the Revolutionary War, and then the travels across the United States to get here to Santa Rosa.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. That was great information. I don't see any questions coming in. So do you have any last words? I'm going to pull up our last screen. If you have any other information to share with our attendees this evening.
Anything?
Not really.
If anybody has any questions, just contact the Recreation and Parks Department and they'll get a hold of us.
Well, great. I appreciate that. Again, the Santa Rosa Recreation and Parks Department is where you can send a question or maybe send a story that you want Sandy and Ray to include in the next edition that, like we said, is being pinned in right now, and taking that information and going for the next edition. And also be sure to not only know this information, but pass it along to friends and family and coworkers that the Santa Rosa Rural Cemetery book is available. It's, if I believe this is correct, Sandy, it was $45 for the book.
Yes.
And it's available at the Steele Lane Community Center here in Santa Rosa, or the Finley Community Center in Santa Rosa during their normal business operating hours. And you could call there as well. So if you have a friend that maybe lives back east that wants a copy to get it shipped out to them, they get a hold of the Steele Lane Community Center or the Finley Community Center and go ahead and purchase a copy through them to have it shipped. Shipping is always $20, Sandy said, which is great information to know. So if you live here in Santa Rosa or in Sonoma County, it might be worth a drive and a little bit of gas money to go and get that book rather than pay for shipping. So thank you so much to Sandy and Ray for, again, sharing all of this great information in this presentation. I want to let people know that are here on Zoom and on Facebook that this presentation has been recorded and it will be posted onto the Historical Society of Santa Rosa's YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube and you just key in Historical Society of Santa Rosa, you will go to their page, and not only will you be able to find this presentation from this evening, but you'll also find presentations from this past year. So a great many presentations have been happening every single month, and you can resource those presentations there. So go to YouTube, enjoy that. And also another great resource is the Historical Society of Santa Rosa's website, which is right down here on the bottom of the screen, www.historicalsocietysantarosa.org. And you can find information about the Historical Society, how to join, how to get their newsletters, and how to make a contribution to get these webinars continuing into the months ahead. And speaking of the months ahead, on Thursday, October 21st, coming right up 4 weeks from now at 6 p.m., the next presentation is how to research your historic property using online databases. And that will be presented by Simone Kremkow, the Senior Library Associate from the History and Genealogy Library that Sandy and Ray resourced, I would assume, many, many times during their research as well. So great folks down there at the History and Genealogy Library, correct?
Correct.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for this evening, and thank you to all of our attendees for coming onto Zoom and experiencing these webinars. Be sure to join us next month and Thursday, October 21st at 6 p.m. Go ahead and join the Historical Society of Santa Rosa. You can do that at their website, historicalsocietysantarosa.org. And until next month, we'll be signing off now. Thank you so much for joining us on Facebook, on Zoom. Good night, Sandy and Ray.
Good night.
Good night.
All right. Have a great evening.
Thank you.